Dr. Cortese, thank you for joining us here on MD Newsline. Can you please present yourself to the audience?
I'm Marianna Cortese. I'm a medical doctor and epidemiologist, and I work at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in Boston.
Thank you so much. And you presented a really interesting study here with some preliminary results at ECTRIM where we're focusing on MS. Can you please tell me a little bit about that study?
Yes, we're very excited because we could present preliminary findings on a major study we're conducting within the U.S. military cohort, where we really wanted to get at the question whether vitamin D is associated with MS risk by both addressing, differences by race, by sex, etc. So 20 years ago, there was a study published, a smaller version, 1/5 of the size what we're presenting today. And it has been considered a landmark study that showed in whites an association between higher vitamin D levels and lower MS risk. Back then, the sample size in the Black subgroup was small and we couldn't see an association, but the questions remained. And today, with 1,400 cases in the US military cohort and double the size of controls, we could look more in detail at these questions.
I'm so curious, what clinical observations prior to research being done led to people even addressing or looking at vitamin D specifically?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. For one, the latitude gradient, a latitude gradient has been described in MS. That means that MS is more common further away from the equator. So people naturally thought of sunlight exposure and vitamin D maybe playing a role for this. And then, over time, there were experimental studies that showed potentially protective effects. And it even extended to treatment trials for vitamin D later on that looked whether vitamin D could help treat MS and have beneficial effect for disease activity.
So I'm so curious, tell me a little bit about what vitamin D does in the body that we think at least creates kind of this protective effect.
Yeah. So vitamin D is known as the bone health vitamin, first of all, but it has many different functions in the body. And in the way it relates to MS, probably it's through modifying the immune response. So the way it could work is you may have heard about the Epstein-Barr virus infection is now considered the leading cause of MS. It could modify the immune response to this virus and protect for MS through that pathway, for example. But it's not entirely understood how it does it for MS. Mm-hmm. It has been studied for many autoimmune diseases, and there's an association also in cancers. So it is a multipotent vitamin and hormone, actually.
So I want to pause for a second and talk a little bit about Epstein-Barr for the people who don't know why it's so significant. And you did present another kind of information about Epstein-Barr specifically, but for those who don't understand what the relationship is with Epstein-Barr, for instance, can you just give me just a soundbite about that?
Right. So the Epstein-Barr virus was a main suspect in the field as a risk factor for decades. The diseases were compared because MS and infectious mononucleosis, which is the symptomatic primary EBV infection, had similarities. Young adulthood, again, more common further away from the equator. So people started comparing those things. And then they saw that actually infectious mononucleosis, or also called kissing disease, or known as kissing disease, was associated with a twofold increased risk of MS. But then people thought, okay, maybe it relates to higher hygiene and sanitation. Both are more likely because of higher sanitation. But that actually turned out to not be true. And over the years, more and more evidence accrued, both experimental, etc., that pointed towards the virus itself as being important. And then in 2022, our group published an important study in Science that really nailed down, and Epstein-Barr virus is now considered the leading cause of MS. Mm-hmm. Again, this study was conducted in the US military and really showed that being infected with the virus drives up the risk by 32-fold compared to not being infected with the virus. Now, why was this so challenging to show? Epstein-Barr virus infection is very common. 95% of adults are infected. So to really show a causal link, we had to go and find a group of people which were not infected with EBV yet, follow them over time, and see whether they developed MS and what happened with their EBV status. And in fact, we saw that almost all individuals that were negative at baseline in this military study went on to develop MS, but before that, seroconverted for EBV, while in the controls, only half of them did. And we in a series of additional analysis and reasonings, we showed that it could not be otherwise explained than that the virus was causing the disease. And this has started a major, effort. More people are focusing on EBV, and there's a lot more funding going in that direction. We're looking at therapeutic options with a vaccine, but also antivirals are being tested as MS treatment.
That's so fascinating. My mind is going in so many different places, especially when you think about the immune system, right? There's so many things that happen in our daily lives where our immune system kind of kicks up. For instance, just having a regular kind of consistent high inflammation in the body, like for people who have things like seasonal allergies or things like that. I'm wondering if there are any factors that have jumped out to you, whether it's from thinking from the Epstein-Barr perspective or thinking about vitamin D. Are there any other factors in people's lives, such as underlying disease, biomarkers, what have you, lifestyle things that might impact or correlate with that response or getting the virus?
Mm-hmm. It is a very successful virus in infecting humans. I cannot think of anything that would definitely modify. It seems that what varies in the population is more when people get it. Almost all people get it throughout life, and then we carry the virus in us. And then in some rare incidences, like MS, it can cause a rare disease. Epstein-Barr virus has also been associated with other diseases. It can cause cancers later in life. It's not that just because everybody has it, it kind of excludes the fact that it can cause a rare disease. It's a rare complication of this virus. So the difference we see is more related to age. So most people get it in early life, and it's not symptomatic. Nobody notices it when they get it at that age. When you get it later in life and escape the infection for some reason, that's often due more to higher sanitation, more or less contact between people, then the symptomatic infection and infectious mononucleosis is more likely. And there may be a gradient across the world how early somebody gets EBV, but eventually everybody does get it. And that's why it was so difficult to show that this virus is necessary to cause the disease.
When you say later in life, what age range counts as later in life, and is that different between men and women?
When they escape childhood infection and enter adolescence, that then infectious mononucleosis becomes more likely. So 30 to 40% of those that haven't gotten the virus yet by adolescence will develop infectious mononucleosis with a strong immune response to the virus.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to viruses, I think of things like mutations, for instance. Are we still dealing generally when we suspect Epstein-Barr with the same variation of Epstein-Barr, or has it evolved over time, and has that impacted us at all?
That's a very good question. There are definitely different strains or genotypes that have been shown across the world. And this is better studied in cancer. For example, there are gastric cancers that are more common in other regions, and they have seen that the Epstein-Barr virus that does cause that cancer is more prevalent in Southeast Asia, for example. In MS, this is definitely one of the things that people are looking at now that we consider EBV the leading cause of MS. We're really interested in understanding better the mechanisms, and one of the hypotheses is that there could be different strains. because there is still a regional variability in MS incidence. And yes, that's an excellent question. We hope to have more answers soon, and there are large consortia looking at that.
Interesting. I'm also wondering, when even we think about things like vitamin D and the modification helping the immune system potentially. I know that the standard for the exams that would say, oh, you're vitamin D deficient, not always based on the most diverse populations.
It's not only.
So when I think about things like vitamin D and how that might help your immune system, the standards for what counts as vitamin D deficiency might not necessarily have been developed based on a diverse population.
Yes.
We also see studies that show that people who have things like neurodivergence, they are more likely to have immune issues and things like that. And so when I think about that, we don't really know exactly how much is deficient. I mean, we have a standard, but I'm wondering if that standard is being questioned at all as we see different people with different genotypes or different life history, traumas, or neurotypes.
That's
how
an
does that
excellent
impact?
point. That's an excellent point. And in fact, the recommendations from the Institute of Medicine are often based on optimal bone health. So for optimal bone health, we say that over 50 nanomole per liter should be enough for most people, and that an intake of 600 international units a day in vitamin D in adults would lead to that level because it increases the levels by 10 nanomoles. So if you measure your level and you're below 50, you're considered deficient or insufficient. Above 50, sufficient. But there's a lot of discussion going on because, as you say, it could depend on the disease. And this is exactly what my talk was about today, that maybe for MS, we have to go higher. And what we saw in what we see in our data is that it is associated with monotonically decreased risk of MS, higher levels, or comparing the highest to the lowest levels is associated with 60% decreased risk. However, when we restrict the data and look only at people who are sufficient with levels above 50, we still see an added protective effect of vitamin D. So that indicates that for MS, we probably can go higher and we would have a great benefit because most people in most countries will have levels below 75 nanomoles per liter. And insufficiency or deficiency, according to bone health, is very common across the world. Even in the Mediterranean region, I was showing one slide, 50% are estimated to have levels below 50 nanomole. This is awareness for skin cancer and sunscreen use. I'm not saying people should not use sunscreen. I hope that's not the message I'm giving because melanoma risk has increased as well. But we're considering vitamin D supplementation and how high do we have to go for MS?
Interesting. And then so we're talking about the protective effects before people might actually be diagnosed. So yeah, let's go back to the military study with vitamin D. What were some of the benefits of using this cohort specifically? And then when it comes to maybe looking at a broader population that's not in military service, what are some of the challenges that you anticipate?
So this is a unique cohort that we access data from. Unique for several reasons. It's, as far as I know, the only cohort in the world with repeated blood samples in young adults. And as we know, MS starts in young adulthood. And when we want to look at a risk factor, we would like to assess that risk factor years before the disease starts, because otherwise we won't know if actually what we see is an effect of the disease. In fact, vitamin D levels may decrease after somebody gets the disease just because of behavioral changes. They go less outside, they don't feel well, they exercise less. So we want to look years before, and this is the advantage of this military cohort. We had up to 3 serum samples in these people up to 30 years before they got the disease and could measure vitamin D and long-term exposure of vitamin D or 25-hydroxyvitamin D in these people and really look at trends, changes before they got them and levels in general.
It's fascinating. So Yes, tell me a little bit about what you were expecting going into this study, and is there anything that jumped out that you did not expect? And I know some of these are preliminary, so whatever you're
Yes.
comfortable talking about.
Yes. So the association in whites is something that we had seen even in the 1/5 of the study population, and there are other studies that have pointed or suggested that. Um, in the black subpopulation, we were hoping to understand better whether vitamin D would also be beneficial. However, we did not see a clear association, and we don't know why. Now, these are the first analysis we're doing. I'm going to conduct more analysis because we genotyped for a protein in the blood that transports vitamin D. And there are studies suggesting that blacks may actually have a different vitamin D physiology. And although they have lower levels in general compared to whites, their bioavailable vitamin D that can be readily used for the tissues may be as high or higher. So maybe the levels are masking the actual vitamin D physiology in this subpopulation, and we need to go more into details about different genotypes and how they use and transport vitamin D. So I hope I can give you more news next time, and we will have more clarity why we don't see a clear trend in this subpopulation.
And when it comes to looking at Black populations, are you looking at the ethnicity as well? For example, maybe people who are first generation immigrants versus people who are the you know have been in America for maybe hundreds of years? Because I
Yeah.
know even looking from an epigenetic perspective, you do
Mhm.
see some changes over
Mhm.
time depending on how far away
Right.
we get. So I'm wondering if
That's a very good point. So the way we defined race in this population is it's information we get from the military, and it's self-reported information. So my assumption is that somebody who's third generation African descent or fifth generation will still consider themselves or mark as black when they report race. But this is a very good point. There's ethnicity, skin color coming in. Blacks, there's a variation there too, and then vitamin D levels may depend on that, but also influence the genotype. If somebody is black but has more European genes for some reason, this could also influence their MS risk. So we hope to find some answers by looking more into the genotypes. Yeah. And we also have data on the Hispanic population that we still have to analyze.
Yeah, I'm really excited about where medicine is going, especially with increased personalization. We hear things like, for example, with because of biomarkers and genotypes and some mutations, people reacting completely differently to the same treatments, even though they have the
Yes.
same type of cancer.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of interested in looking at that eventually. Where do you see this study going next, and what are you most excited about?
So I have a list of analysis I will do in the next weeks. We have the Hispanic subpopulation. We will decode the genotypes for some of the transporters. We have one of the main genotypes for MS, and I want to also see whether the association varies by that genotype. We would like to do more analysis in those that are sufficient or have sufficient levels and see, where do we max out MS risk? And then also calculate what would be the benefit if we did recommend in the general population to supplement vitamin D. How many cases could we prevent? And what would be the supplementations we would recommend to men, women, whites, blacks, Hispanics, etc. So this is where the study is going. We really hope to be able to issue public health recommendations, because it's unlikely that there will be a clinical trial on this. It would pose major scientific, ethical, and logistic challenges to do a prevention trial on vitamin D and MS.
I wonder if there's been any work done with mouse models on this. Even when people are looking at things like Alzheimer's, for instance, they have, the knock-in models, and then they kind of know who has the genes. So I'm wondering if that might be a way to eventually.
So there are studies in mice, and the mice, one of the mouse models of MS, EAE, has been studied with vitamin D, and they clearly show a benefit. So the data shows in the same direction. For public health recommendations, like almost like prescribing it like a drug, the final question would come from a clinical trial. You would go into a population that has a high risk of MS in maybe in Scandinavia, let's say, and do a clinical trial supplementing a part of the population and the other part not. But there are major issues because the beneficial effect of vitamin D is known, and not treating somebody who is deficient is actually unethical. So these are just some of the first issues that we would encounter. It would be an entire population, relatively long follow-up. So given that vitamin D is so safe and inexpensive, and we will also look at that more, has added benefits for other diseases, and there doesn't seem to be a very low toxic level. So toxic levels, you would have to supplement extreme doses. I think, this is my humble opinion, it would be almost unethical to not, given that the data is so strong and clear, to not issue recommendations, although there's no trial. But, people may have different opinions on that.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, that this conversation about bioavailable vitamin D versus just testing for the protein and things like that. Is there anything that you'd like to see change in the way that we measure vitamin D levels when it comes to that?
That's a good point. One effort that has been underway since 2010, there is a vitamin D standardization program to really make different laboratories and different methods to measure vitamin D more comparable. And that has been really successful. So if I recommend 10 nanomole per liter, does that mean the same if vitamin D is measured by any of these methods? That's a very important detail. Bioactive or free vitamin D can be measured, but it's not routinely done. It's much more laborious. Could be an additional added step to research, definitely. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, this is very fascinating. I'm wondering if in the future you're thinking at all about using things like artificial intelligence or machine learning to enhance your work at all.
We're thinking about that every day, and I'm honest, I'm using it as a help tool for sure. In terms of looking at the data, we are using machine learning in some of the omics data we have. Omics meaning we have information on all molecules in the blood, or we have antibody responses to all viruses that infect humans. This is considered omics study because it's like multidimensional, large data. Yes, I don't exclude it. We're thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm asking that because I know that I've talked to several researchers that are using machine learning to analyze data from past clinical trials as well, to see if there's anything mixed that would
With large language models.
yes, to see if there's anything that we could kind of cross reference, because as I go to all these conferences, obviously a lot of doctors don't talk across specialties,
Right.
right? But you're all kind of talking about the same thing.
Right.
There's always the immune system involved for some reason. It's always a form of inflammation somewhere, somehow. And obviously the body itself is a unit and environment unto itself. And so it just feels like there are kind of non-linear conversations that would be helpful kind of to get like a larger picture. And so I'm always curious as to how some of those non-linear points, connections, and bridges can be built across specialties.
I agree. And the larger the data sets, the more complex, it's easy to miss something. And just, the only important aspect I would say is to approach that step as a hypothesis creating step. We will find maybe many things, but then the biological thinking also has to kick in at some point to try and make sense of what we find. And yes, as a first step, absolutely, yes.
I have a random question about Epstein-Barr virus. When people get MS, and obviously they likely have Epstein-Barr virus, what are some of the symptoms that people first present with before being officially diagnosed with MS? Are there any trends or differences in people's original symptoms depending?
There are no differences because all MS patients have EBV.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the things that researchers noticed quite early on, that the seropositivity for EBV was 100% in MS patients, while in the rest of the population about 95%. And this may seem like a small difference, but for a virus that infects almost everybody, you know, I compare it often to the first lung cancer studies. At that time, the numbers were pretty similar. So everybody smoked. Let's say 95% of the population smoked. But among lung cancer patients, 100% smoked. So it's a similar thing. And just because lung cancer was common, it didn't mean it wasn't a cause of smoking was common. It doesn't mean it wasn't a cause of lung cancer. And we have a similar situation here. Now people are smoking less, and it's more obvious. Not everybody that smokes will get lung cancer. And the same, we all have EBV. Not everybody will get MS. And now it's about finding out what adds to the susceptibility and why do some people develop it. Yeah. But the symptoms will not differ because everybody has EBV.
And what are some of those? What are some of the symptoms that...
The onset symptoms?
Yes.
They can affect any part of the brain. So classic is optic neuritis, is the inflammation of or demyelination of the optic nerve. So they will have an episode of blindness on one eye. Or they feel sensory changes, paresthesias, meaning lowered sensibility in an arm. Or they stumble because their motoric impulses don't reach the leg anymore. So it really depends where the lesions are that will create the symptom.
Interesting. And then are there any other kind of indications in other aspects of the other parts of the body? I'm thinking about things like unrelated, but NAD receptor encephalitis.
Any
NAD plus receptor encephalitis, for example. It's a rare disorder, but they think that maybe it might have start in the uterus somewhere, but it eventually ultimately impacts the brain and then presents in very wide range of ways.
That's we don't know the mechanism. We know that EBV is somehow starting this. Whether it starts in the periphery or EBV crosses the blood-brain barrier is not clear. There has been a very recent study, very interesting, that it seems like it affects the B lymphocytes in the blood to go into the brain and settle where actually some of the lymphatic tissue that has been shown to remain in MS patients, submeningeal, will settle, and that they can attract more immune cells. So there are first studies, very important studies coming out that look at that.
That's exciting. And that conversation about crossing the blood-brain barrier is actually really interesting because, you know, an immunologist would say like immuno issues beget immune issues. Like if you have an autoimmune disorder, you're more likely to have another one, even though they're unrelated. And so I'm wondering if this idea of, you know, things crossing the blood-brain barrier, it's good to hear that they're being kind of explored more. I think especially because people who have chronic inflammation, you know, tend to have chronic inflammation all over.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's eczema, asthma, atopic dermatitis to psoriasis, Crohn's, rhinitis, it's like right there, you know. So I'm very interested to find out.
Yeah, there's a big area of research.
Interesting. Well, this has been amazing. Is there anything that we haven't covered, or what would you like your fellow doctors outside of this practice to know about MS, vitamin D, Epstein-Barr?
Stay tuned. A lot of exciting things will be coming out in the next years. I think nailing down the leading cause was a major step in the right direction. We will see, you know, there are a lot of companies working on vaccines, also therapeutic vaccines. One thing I'm very excited about is to see whether antiviral treatment targeting EBV can treat MS, because the science paper we published showed that is important to cause MS, but we don't know if it's still important after the disease starts. So if we see that antivirus can treat MS that target EBV, that would be a game changer, and bring the potential of a cure even closer, because then we wouldn't need to use immunomodulatory or disease-modifying drugs that immunosuppress, etc. There's an added effect. We don't know. That's like future music, but just knowing the main culprit can really narrow down the effort. Vitamin D, extremely important because we are all infected with EBV. So what can we do? Somebody asked I cannot change that. What can I do? Making sure you have so at least sufficient levels would be a start, and it will help you for other things as well. But with our study, I hope we can give more details on levels, also for people who maybe are at high risk because a relative has MS, etc.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
This is an
you.
amazing conversation, and I look forward to more of your work.